Before we get started, I did want to thank our partners that make this event possible. First off, Holistic Think Tank, who is developing the interdisciplinary school subject. You can learn more about that today. Actually, in our next session, we'll be talking about that. Cortico is our transcription partner, who uses artificial intelligence to enable human listening. They make sense of conversations that they collect. They kind of bring about community voices. If you check out any of the transcriptions, you'll see that. And they also have a session today. Antioch University and the Antioch Center for School Renewal. They work with schools and communities to bring lasting positive change in day-to-day school experiences. Great college, do a lot of really cool work. They had a session yesterday that you can watch a recording of. Education Evolving with Teacher-Powered Schools. That's a network of teacher teams that secure autonomy to design and run schools that are teacher-led and teacher-partnered. They have a session tomorrow. And then finally, Unruler, which is a social learning app. They make holistic growth visible through authentic moments. You can see a demonstration of that today. Links to all of our partners can be found in any of the YouTube comments, as well as on our Discord. There's a section where you can read more about them. We don't partner with anyone that we don't actually believe in or utilize. They're all super cool folks. So with that said, I am thrilled to introduce José Luis Vilson and to dive deeper into this conversation about teaching and learning in 2023. As always, feel free to drop questions into the chat and/or raise your hand. We'll kind of just take this organically as time comes. As always, make sure you lower your hand after you raise it, after you ask your question, so we don't keep calling on you. And if we don't get to your question in the chat, just keep asking it to make sure that we address it. Otherwise, Jose, I'm going to turn it over to you for a second to just do like how are things going in the very busy world of José Luis Vilson with educolor and everything else that's going on.
I want to thank y'all for showing up as rectangles in the ways that y'all do. It's yes, that's a math thing. It feels weird doing a virtual conference when it feels like everything has been popped open from a quarantine perspective, but then B, seeing all these folks who've decided that everything is COVID. And so like now that COVID is endemic, even though we know all the effects of it, we've decided to convene virtually, and good on us for doing so. So I think it's fine. And of course, as you know, I've had a number of convenings that have happened over virtual, but also face-to-face. And I think the running theme for me of 2023 is that folks are just tired of being tired, right? Like, it was one thing for us to be tired from 2020 to 2022, and I respect that 100%. Of course, I was also still teaching at the end of 2020. But then there was something to be said for folks who are saying, you know what, we're going to go get our professional development. We're going to go get our community together. We're going to go build with our people. We're going to find ways to connect, because we really need that connection. And whether it's over our computers or it's face-to-face or somewhere in between, it's good on us for having done that, So that's kind of where I'm sitting. And yes, I'm hyper busy. Like, for all the things that I do put out on social media, there's a bunch of stuff I don't. And so good for me for not telling anybody about those elements, but it's a healthy reckoning with what it means to be busy in this moment in time, and how like so much of what it means to be busy is often us just trying to fill in all the different times that look like they're free, but we don't need to do that. We could actually just be like, we could just find space to breathe. So that's where I'm at right now.
All right, so we're going to dive into the Q&A. We'll start off with Jack. Good timing, Jack. He says, "Hi, Jose. If you could have every teacher take one message away from your work, what would it be?" That's a great starter.
Just one, huh, Jack? Just one. I feel like I gave y'all a lot in that keynote. I would say that the one lesson I would love for folks to have gotten is that, a lot of us strive towards this thing we call a shared humanity, right? And this notion that we can come together and collectively think about how we develop interpersonal relationships, intrapersonal, that means like within the self, and then what all these different relationships mean with respect to society more generally. And without addressing the various ways that we've done harm and pain. Because like there's ways to name those things, right? Like we have names like white supremacy, transphobia, homophobia, racism, anti-blackness, so on and so forth. But these are all just names for like pain and hurt. And so when we name those things, then we can probably get closer to remedying the thing that keeps us further and further away from this shared humanity. And so that's been a guiding light for me, being able to say, yes, like I am a full human being, and I want everybody to also feel like full human beings, and I want other human beings to also respect each other's humanity in this way. And so when we have those values, then we can build together in ways that folks are often astonished by. There are folks who are literally like, we can't have it where everybody feels equal. That's wild. I was like, actually, we could do so much better if we broaden our imaginations and we come in to spaces with our whole minds and our whole hearts. And so that's what I hope folks can come out with, is this notion that when we establish a real deep set of values about ourselves, that we can actually create environments all around us that also reflect those values. I hope that's hopeful.
I'll go ahead and ask my question if that's okay. So I put this in the Discord as I was listening to your keynote, Jose, and one of the things that I think is interesting is that, you know, we're privileged as a conference to have a big interdisciplinary focus, but also have invited some math educators, you know, such as yourself, to the table. And also we have a track from David Hill on STEM education, particularly in cultivating, celebrating diversity in STEM. And I know, you know, recruiting and retaining Black educators has been a big focus for you as well. And I worry because the work that the problem I see in the work HRP does is often that math fields, STEM fields, that discipline has kind of built seemingly the biggest barriers, the biggest resistance to the things that they perceive as being a challenge to the high standards and the high rigor of the STEM classroom. And I wonder, you know, with your perspective as a math educator in that space, how can we work to break down or break through that resistance and build the relationships and show how this is a necessary part of STEM and math education, not a distraction from it?
Let me take it from two lenses. The first is that historically, we know that every culture has some affinity towards STEM, even when it doesn't show up on a standardized test. Like there is a real authentic understanding of science, technology, engineering, and math when people have to find ways to survive in an environment that is often hostile to them. So to say that we don't have people who, especially Black people, who are thinking about STEM would be limiting and narrowing at best, right? So everyone is thinking about STEM in one way, shape, or form, even if it doesn't show up in the technical field on the paper, right? Because so much of what gets out there is like this very narrow definition of STEM, as opposed to like a broader notion that we try to create sciences wherever we are and however we walk and however we do things. Like that is a thing. Once we learn how to broaden that, I think we'll see that reflected in who gets to be seen as STEM. Secondly is I'm also noting that for many of the folks who would love to be in STEM, there are significant barriers, including licensure fees, standardized tests that people often like pay thousands of dollars to prep for, not to mention some of the super low wages that come with, I guess, professions like ours that limit how many people can actually go into them. And so when I have conversations with policymakers, it's often like, how are we relieving debt for folks who want to come into this space? Because once, for example, for myself, me coming from my poor background and knowing the environment that I was in, I consistently had to think about how I was going to use the money, not just for my loans, but also for my family. My mother needed money. My a younger brother needed money, so on and so forth. Because once I graduated with my undergrad degree from Syracuse University in the STEM fields, by the way, it was evident that I had to like give some sort of money back so that everybody like was able to share from that money. And if you don't have that generational wealth, then it becomes that much harder for us to gain entry into fields like this. And yes, like if you chose to go into computer science or computer engineering right after undergrad, then you're very fortunate to be able to say, oh, like I get $60,000 starting. And most teachers are like, $60,000 starting. I gotta wait like 10 years to get to that point, right? And that's wild. That's wild to think about. But right. So if that now, what that I think that also means though too is that folks who are in like admin/boss levels also have to think about the value added of having more diversity across the board when it comes to like getting more people that look perhaps different from them. And we know this statistically. That look different from them to give them different renditions of what things might look like. I do think specifically, for example, maybe this could be helpful to the movie Hidden Figures. Imagine if the three women who were highlighted in the movie hadn't been in that room. To what extent would the innovations that NASA proudly espouses, would they have been able to get to that point, right? Without those lenses, it becomes that much harder. And people say, well, anybody could have done that. Yeah, but not anybody did. Like it took the three women who were highlighted in the film, three Black women in that film, to have a different perspective, to have a different approach to STEM. Still brilliant, and still did it from their own perspective and said, hey, like this could be another way that is not standardized. And yes, like these are the something that occurs to me, which I'm sure a lot of you resonate with, is there's a certain like look, feel, and set of like, I guess, dispositions, for lack of a better word, that allow for people to say, well, this is a good candidate for admin. This is a good candidate for this higher up boss level. This is a good template for what we want to see as like the representative of STEM fields, for example, as opposed to saying, yeah, like we could just have a whole bunch of people who are really brilliant and lift them up, and then they'll learn on the go, and we're better for it because we have all these perspectives that we can lean on, all these different knowledges that we can lean on, all these experiences that could benefit us. So that I think that's the value item more generally, right? Like, what does it look like for us to fully delve deeply into like true diversity, as opposed to like just changing the faces, but still doing the same things every single way all the time.
And to follow up on that too, Jose, so it sounds like, you know, the system just needs to deal. There are some structural barriers that are preventing Black people from getting into the STEM fields that the system needs to grapple with. And I think on your end too, you run this incredible organization, Educolor, who I think a couple people, perhaps in this conference here, were also part of that conference last week, which is incredible. I think, you know, before we address any other questions, do you just want to give a rundown of what you do with that organization for folks who may not know, maybe some highlights from that conference last week? Because again, to emphasize, you are a machine here working this summer, doing that and then joining us. So highlight that work for us. How can we follow, get involved, and do that stuff too?
You're right.
Awesome.
I did give a keynote right after the first set of sessions that we had at Educolor Summit for this organization. So yes, like it's all aligned. I'll try to be quick. Educolor is an organization dedicated to race and social justice issues. We've been around for at least the last 8-9 years, though more formally over the last 3 to 4 years, thinking as a nonprofit. And I think some of our more powerful pillars is like noting that we could have a lot of different people with vast opinions about education, but we all try to level them to the point where everybody feels like they're equal. So luckily this year, for example, we had Pedro Noguera, we had Carla España and Lucia Dira Herrera, who, if you haven't picked up the book En Comunidad, you totally should, especially those of you who are working with students who speak languages other than English. And we had Korsho Hassan, and we had so many different people speaking to each other and with each other. But then they actually did the thing where they not only keynoted, but they actually came back and built community with us in the comments. So it was like, oh, so this is what educolor is about, as opposed to like a keynote that, oh, they spoke and then they just, go fly in a plane somewhere and they go somewhere. Educolor tries to ensure that people are consistently in conversation with each other about this thing we try to do with education. And that's the point of the shared humanity pillar, right? Is noting that when we can amplify educators of color, we're also amplifying educators more generally. When we do this work for students of color, we are also doing this for all students more generally, because when our pedagogy is good, then that means everybody can learn from our pedagogy in the ways that we do our work. And so it's almost like the tide that lifts all boats. And what educolor is trying to do is create a tide that can lift every single boat and make everybody better. And so that's what I hope that we are able to do in our work. And of course, we're grassroots, so we also try to do our best with what we have. But what we have is a lot. We're wealthy, not financially, but in all the other ways.
It genuinely is such a cool space. And Nick said in the chat, but like the social media presence is spot on. Like it's just a great spot to just see like what's going on, learn from things, subscribe, etc. You check out the websites in the description. We do have a few questions queued up here. I'm going to start with my own, just because it's in line with what you were just talking about, which is living in some tension here. What does it look like for teachers to persuade, work with, push back against administrators who may be at worst like pantomime DEI or like valuing diverse voices, or maybe at best are just ignorant to it? Considering, at least in my experience, most administrators look like me. They're white guys. And they just, I don't know. I've had some poor experiences in this regard. And then Thomas kind of builds on that question too, which is, how do you work with and push back against admin who parrot DEI talking points, but mean something completely differently when they say that?
Oof, only the good questions here, huh? Okay, so let's start off with a little some sociology. So I'm thinking about how one of the main functions of an administrator is to create a buffer between what happens within the school building and what happens at the district level, right? And at their best, the best principals are able to either highlight the great work that's happening within the school, or at the very least create some sort of like wall that allows for the good work to be preserved and moved. And so what I find when I go to schools that have great principals, like they can say whatever they like, but then when you go to the classrooms, the students are doing what they're supposed to do. Teachers are doing what they're supposed to do, because in each of those spaces, like they're cultivating their work, and all the principal has to do is create some sort of buffer that allows for that good work to happen, right? And so that's kind of what a lot of teachers that I know actually really want. They could care less about like whether the principal is an outright activist. If they are, great. That's wonderful. But really, at baseline, they should at least say, hey, like, I see you're doing great work. And I'm thinking to Linda Darling-Hammond, where she says, it's not about standard practice, it's about appropriate practice, which is a whole different set of ways of thinking about this work. And so when you think about it that way, it's like, oh, so you need a teacher who can develop appropriate practice, and you need a principal who can see that appropriate practice and allow it to kind of build. It's similar to being a gardener, where you're kind of letting the plant grow as you need to, and then of course provide appropriate minerals and vitamins and soil and so forth, and of course try to guard for some of the elements that they can't often like control in their own right. So at worst, unfortunately, we have administrators who are either openly hostile to it, or completely agree with like whatever district mandate that tells people to like be harsher to teachers, be harsher to students, be harsher to community, all because like some tests, some numbers said that it wasn't going well within the school. These are the sorts of things that get us further away from real, authentic, so-called DEI. And it's funny because like, as much as I've used the language diversity, equity, inclusion, I think those are all useful tools. I also have recently started thinking about it more as systems thinking and systems design. And when we start moving in that way, we start seeing that the people who are most likely to espouse notions of DEI are people who are thinking systemically about how people can be moved and how people like can move when they work together. Like the thing we were trying to deconstruct, I'm not saying destroy, though I've had that rendition too. When we deconstruct our systems and the ways that they operate now, then we can see how when we look at every brick, some of them need to be set aside and some of them will help build the new foundation. And this is the way we relearn and we unlearn and we continue to build, right? But then as we're thinking about DEI, right, it also means like every brick necessarily has to be helpful towards something that allows for more people to feel included. So as I said earlier, right, once you create systems that allow for trans people, for people who identify as LGBTQIA plus, right, it allows for everybody to feel like they belong in the school, and not just the folks who I named, but unapologetically so. When you ensure that you have racial justice and social justice of some form within the school, it allows for everybody, especially our white students, to feel good. Because the other thing too, that I'm going to take this to the converse, right, is like white students also need a shared humanity. They also need a way to think about their fellow students. They also need to say to themselves, I don't need to fear you. I don't need to reject you. I can read this book that is not about me, but I can empathize with and sympathize with in one way, shape, or form. I too can be an active listener. I too can be in community and eat with you. Make sure that we have community and walk across the street where I know you live and try to build community and try to protect you in one way, shape, or form too, right? Like our white students need to know that they can do this. And in our current context, so much of what is said about, oh, fear, like fear is a valid emotion, but it's constantly being used to reinforce the notion that white students have to fear everybody else, and so have to do it in a way that like instills power upon them so that they can eradicate other people, which is not the direction we want to go in. And so what I'm reading as I'm looking at like not just Nick's question, but also Thomas's question is saying like, we need admin who also believe that white students deserve high expectations for themselves too. And I'm saying that semi-ironically because y'all know what it is, but that is to say, like, the one thing that I did when I was in the classroom for the 15 years was I would start with organizing students, right? And by organizing, I mean, I would actually be, it's not a prerequisite, but being nice to students was like a thing at my school. And sometimes like people felt like you needed to be mean to students. I felt like I could go the other way and still do what I'm supposed to do. Secondly, I would try to resolve conflicts right within my classroom and try to build that out. And then third, I would try to ensure that my students felt like they had a voice in their own education. They felt very free, in some cases, a little too free perhaps, to tell me how I was doing with my own teaching. But, and that was always humbling too, right? But within that, once they learned that they could do these things, they felt like they could enact their power towards everything else around them. So they felt like they could actually have a say in all their educational experiences from then on out. And they would also be the biggest gossipers, and that they actually went and told the parents and the community members, and the community will reflect that back onto administrators who were often hostile towards what I was trying to do. And they left me alone because now I had the parents on my side and I had the students on my side. And I think that's an instructive way of approaching how we combat against people who want to use DEI in awful ways, and or just straight up like try to diss what's happening with DEI more generally. So I hope that's helpful. I think these are things that we can keep exploring, but that's an approach.
Awesome. Go ahead, Lynx.
I was wondering a little bit about, often when we talk about issues of inclusion and equity within schools, we talk about it from the perspective of a diverse student body and protecting diverse students. And I have come up in listening to your keynote when you talked about that marginalized groups never stopped feeling human themselves. Others tried to dehumanize us. That hit me really hard. I'm a trans educator in a very anti-trans country, Panama. And I left teaching kids because of the fear of being labeled a groomer. And I didn't really realize that until very recently, that it's and so when we talk about diversity and inclusion, and often we're talking about the way we're protecting kids and the way we dismantle these systems, I wonder what tools you have found in your work to also support teachers within these systems, because it is like the burden of proof is often on marginalized groups. Like if a white teacher teaches about critical race theory, or if a white teacher teaches about anti-racism, then it's like, oh, look, the great work this person is doing. And then when a person of color teaches about anti-racism, it's like, oh, ideology. And so it is this, what tools have you seen in that respect, or how has your experience been in that respect towards protecting the teachers from marginalized groups doing this revolutionary work?
I want to elevate not just your experience, but I want to thank you for bringing that into the space. I think that I've had some conflicting thoughts about these notions, because on the one end, it's hard to tell us that we need to consistently be the educators of our own experience. But if we don't do it, then it often gets diluted, commercialized, and then it doesn't actually get to the heart of the thing that we were trying to get at to begin with. And so I have found that it's okay if you don't want to keep pushing that work per se, as somebody who is marginalized, because you may be tired, and that's okay. You want to go recharge and then come back so you can fight again. And it's also okay if there is a white person who happens to do the work with white people. I do think that there has to be space for white people to do work with other white people, right? So that we don't have to do it. And I'm perfectly okay if they end up becoming more famous, because as long as they're doing the work and I don't have to keep doing that work, then it allows me to feed my people, which is like the folks. So for example, like I don't do any one-on-one courses. Like educolor has consistently said, we're like, it's okay if you want to do one-on-one, go do that with other people in the space that we're in right now. We have to go beyond one-on-one. Like I can't like consistently tell you what racism is and whether or not it exists. Like I'm not gonna prove that for you. You have somewhere else so you can do that with. And I think there are other spaces that are also thinking about what it means to also do 201, 301, 401 work as well. Particularly along the lines of like transness, I guess queerness, and other forms of sexual identity, for example, along with even disability, right? Like what it means for us to say, oh, well, we have to be thoughtful about disability. No, actually, like disability exists. What are you going to do next? Like, what's the next step? And so in my experience, I have found that the people who consistently want 101 is because like they want to be able to tell their friends about the work that they're doing, and they haven't been able to muster up the courage to do so. Like enough already. I mean, we learned from 2020 that we have a billion folks who've gotten bestsellers and all these different texts that have risen to #1, so on and so forth. But then have systems actually changed? And if they haven't, then I don't know what to tell you. Like, that fine. So you bought the books and you got the knowledge, but then you never applied it, which means, and the application isn't going to show up in your #1's bestseller text. It's going to show up in how students receive an education. It's going to show up, hopefully, in our policy within the next 5-10 years, after like a certain wave of people have left and we've decided to combat that. It's going to show up in like, even, I don't know, like just our ways of being. Like, we won't have to have that conversation anymore if the learning actually happened, right? Like, but because it didn't really, if it doesn't really happen, then what was what was 2020 really for? Like, what was it for? So I think that's kind of where I'm sitting, is trying to figure out what the application of all this knowledge is going to do for us, and then whether or not those who are fighting, and yourself included, things, is like, at what point do we say we have to like sing back to the choir, because sometimes the choir needs singing to as well, and then at what point do we have to like tell folks who aren't in the choir, like, hey, we have to move beyond that which we're working with right now. Is that helpful? All right, cool.
Okay, I have a question here. I'm going to attempt to distill this down between two different folks. We have Simone and Macy asking questions surrounding kind of the admin-teacher relationship when it comes to valuing teacher voices, listening to teachers, and operating within a neoliberal system. So in a sense of like, there's kind of the tokenistic application of DEI by admin, which we've addressed so far a little bit. But there's also the tokenistic aspect of like, we listen to teachers, but not necessarily listening to teachers. At the exact same time, with that mindset, teachers who buy into kind of the neoliberal policies as well. So in summary, Simone says, I have found in my district that at times I resonate more with the vision of admins, both at site and the district level, than many of my colleagues. However, I don't want to fall into the trap of undermining a union or a fuel for anti-teacher rhetoric and everything that goes along with that. So could you speak to like the cognitive dissonance of like administrative vision and what's being said, and doing that work alongside listening to teachers and actually getting things done? I don't know if that question makes sense, but there's a lot going on.
Okay, let me try to take a stab at 3 levels I'm hearing, and actually one of them I'm pulling right from the comments. So okay, like when I say when I say nice, actually I should be more sharp. Kindness is a set of actions that allows for folks to feel like they're being made whole, as opposed to niceness. I should have said kind, not nice, mainly because like nice to me often means we're like saying things and trying to massage at the shallow level, whereas kindness implies something just a little bit deeper. So those of us, for example, who are from New York City, we love being kind, not nice. So like, we won't say good morning when we walk by each other and smile and all that other stuff. But if you look lost, we will reach out and say, hey, like, where do you need to go? How can I help you get there? And things of that nature. So that's the thing for me, and that's worth exploring. Second is that it's like, when you have a set of values, sometimes it sidesteps a lot of like the framing that we see now. So for instance, when I see something racist happen among my colleagues, I am quick to call it out, or in, depending on who it is and what my relationship is with the person, right? That I don't necessarily think that like gets away from a negotiation with other educators collectively building towards contract situations, right? And so it's actually healthy for professionals to speak to other professionals about their practice and then what makes sense in terms of the collective benefit for students and communities more generally. You can do that, and you can do that with tact, or you can also be abrasive at times if you think it's creating some form of harm. I think to the times, and I know of, because of the last question, it's pertinent actually. We had a student who came in who asked us to call them by a different name than the one that was on the register because they openly identified as trans. And unfortunately, my school at the time had real conflicts about, like, to the degree to which, like, they had some form of transphobia or transaggressiveness. Of course, I didn't espouse any of that. I thought all of it was trash. And I thought that, yeah, like, we should have just acknowledged and been more responsive to the student, because we should be welcoming all students, not regardless of who they are, but because of who they are, which you all already heard about, right? But unfortunately, because of the hostility that happened among the adults, some people felt uncomfortable calling it out because they were like, but what if I upset my peers? What if I upset my admin? And what if they, like, take revenge on me for calling them out for them being less human? And I was like, well, I'm getting in trouble anyway for other things that I'm doing. I might as well get in trouble for this too. Like, let's go. And I was that kind of teacher. I don't necessarily know that everybody feels that way, but when you have a set of values that are aligned to justice, that are aligned to trying to create a pro-whole child framework, not just anti-racist, then you're necessarily going to excuse some other, like, systems that say, like, here's the admin, here's the teacher, here's my peer, here's my other peer. Because when we don't call it out, for example, we get folks, for example, who maybe have just taught a year and they were espousing white supremacist notions, and then all of a sudden they become the governor of Florida. Like, that's a real thing. And by the way, like, that he was a teacher for a year, and I couldn't tell to what extent other colleagues called him out on it, though some students definitely did, especially the Black students. And so all that to say, it's confusing when you're trying to figure out, like, which battles you're going to pick and choose, because you can't battle everything. But when you stand on your values, it actually makes the battles easier, because then you're able to say, okay, this is a battle that no one else is going to take on. I probably have to name it. This is a battle that I can do in squad. Thank you for naming that. Yeah, like, Ron DeSantis was actually a classroom teacher for a whole year. And 2 points that I'll bring up. First is that his Black students were quick to name that he had so-called controversial standpoints on slavery and Reconstruction, for that matter, and all these things. And it's in a New York Times article somewhere. I'm sure Nick or Chris can pull it up if they wish. But the second thing is that he most definitely had, I'm going to say, I'm trying to be careful, but I'm not going to be careful. He had awkward relationships with his students and with his peers, in that he liked to fraternize a little too much with the students and go to their parties and that sort of thing when he was a young teacher. And so that's all in there. Thank you for putting that up, Chris. But yeah, like, we ought to be unafraid to just, like, be in line with our own values. And then if it just so happens that an admin agrees with us, then so be it. And to what end, right? Versus if we don't, then we may miss out on a battle that we should have chosen. So that's kind of where I'm at.
That makes all the sense.
Skylar, thank you.
The chat is going 1,000 miles an hour, and it's awesome. I'm scrolling up to Mason's question, which I said was a great question about 15 minutes ago. So it's awesome. This is such a good conversation. And this was a part that struck out to me in the keynote as well. Just recognizing, you said in there, when we sign that contract, be it for charter, public, or whatever, we become agents of the state, right? And so we have to not only recognize, but situate ourselves in that context, either as instruments and tools of state and state policy, particularly in the light of policies like DeSantis's and Iowa and others around the country, that we either participate in and propagate, or we become tools of resistance in that too. And Mason said that there. You mentioned that teachers are inherently political, and we create policy in our classrooms. So students are at the receiving end of these things. How can we build, they ask, a more equitable, revolutionary set of classroom policies when anti-truth members of our community want us to follow the quote unquote traditional authoritarian classroom model? If there's tension between, I guess, the community and what those values that you're referring to there, how do we work to break through on that?
I am not of the belief that any educator in our context, whether they be public, private, charter, is 100% revolutionary. Like, let me just start off there, because I think for us, a critical mass of us, we're often asked to go well beyond what is necessary in order to make real radical change. We should allow ourselves to be imperfect in the ways that we approach this work, because we're all in totally different contexts, whether we're within the United States or across the world, wherever we're at. Like, we're trying to figure out the best means to the best ends in our situation. Hence why the agents of the state is an appropriate frame for what we're trying to do, because no one can be 100% revolutionary within any school building. That's what I would contend. But then within that, I think it starts from doing some real active listening. It's simple, not easy. Know what I mean? So there's two ways to approach it, but I'm going to use a more hybrid model, which is to say you could be overt and subvert at the same time. There are things that I did in my classroom that were fairly overt. So when I decided that I wasn't going to have sign-up sheets for the bathroom, for kids to go to the bathroom, that was fairly overt, because it stood against what my principal and admin had wanted because of safety or whatever, and kids can't walk in and out of classrooms. But I was like, I don't know how to do PP checks unless like they just go themselves. Like, that's not my business. If I could just name it, right? Like, go pee. And if in fact the student doesn't want to go pee, but they just like want to go take a selfie for, I don't know, Snapchat or whatever, how do I control that? Like, that's not my thing, as opposed to students who actually do need to go to the bathroom, and then they end up being encumbered by some wayward policy that says, like, I have to control 30 students' bodies at a time. That's bananas to me. Subvert, there were times when they would say, well, this is not part of the lesson. Like, why are you talking about Trayvon Martin or this, that, and the third? But what I would do is I say, okay, like for my do now, I would just love to open up the room for anyone to bring up any conversations, any thoughts or feelings or questions. And then within that, like, we'd start a conversation, like they'd start a conversation, the students would. So that already relieved me off of whatever it is. Though, of course, I was kind of implicitly like trying to get them to do it. But then they'd ask me for my opinion. I'd say, if you really want my opinion, I'll give it to you. But once everybody has had a chance to have a conversation about it. And then when I gave my opinion, it was often like, here are the facts that we see. Fact, 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 fact. And then based on that, here's something that is worth elevating for everybody here, as opposed to me giving my full opinion, which that was a way to be subversive. Now, have I been overt about some things? Absolutely. There were some ways that like I definitely was overt about it, but it really depended on who my administrator was at the time, and how much so-called rope I had. But It's hard. It's hard. The active listening part isn't just like I heard it. It's more like I took note of how I can recognize the moment, recognize the students who are in front of me, understand whether or not the thing that I'm saying is actually going to make it through their minds and hearts. And then also whether or not you're going to have those one or two students who may inevitably like tell somebody else about the thing that you were trying to do from a danger perspective. Like, will this action inevitably lead to your firing? Are you willing to assess that risk and then take that risk? And if you are, cool, go ahead and do it. And by the way, like, just because you have so-called tenure, it's not tenure, it's really due process. So like even those of us with really strong unions, we recognize that like the union ain't always going to protect us, and 90% of the cases they often don't have the power to do it. It's just due process. And so being able to name it is important, and assessing those risks is important. But if you're really about this life, then the risk already comes in. And for some of us, just merely walking into a building in our whole selves is a political act. So it's hard because I'm not here to give you a straight answer, because you have to be able to assess what your environment is and what you're walking into and who you have to like organize with and who you have to organize against. So I hope that's helpful.
I think, especially, Jose, as a white person in this context, and right as a predominantly white conference, I think I'll say this half a dozen times over the course of the week, because it sort of became my mantra as I started to do this work in my, again, predominantly white context, which is, right, we all need to be able to evaluate our relative power and privilege, and then leverage that within the context to see really like what are the real versus the perceived risks, because it's pretty often the case that whatever we're afraid of being up against actually won't come to pass, and we can get away with a lot, right? Kind of muddling around in our own context, and yeah. So then I think then closing things out here, is in our last few minutes, what are big takeaways? What's the kind of the closing message, the call to action that you would have participants take away from our conference to restore humanity with you?
Only the easy questions today.
Sorry.
I know, it's okay. No, I'm built for this. I think number one, as I'm reading everybody's comments, I understand that, we're all trying to figure out our own positionality with all the things we're trying to do, right? Like so you're consistently put in positions where somebody's trying to like tell you what to do, and you finally encounter somebody who's like, actually, like, I'm telling you what I do, but I have to work with you so you can figure out what you need to do, which is a whole different orientation. And I think our professional development often has educators just sit back and like receive and then take notes, and then that's all we get, as opposed to what would actually restore humanity, which is like, let me try to build with you. Let me try to figure out a way for us to construct something together. Let me try to figure out how like we can use the gifts that you already have within yourself so you can cultivate that, not just for yourself but for other people, particularly the young students who you work with. And again, I've mentioned this: simple, not easy. Like, it's simple to say we need basic needs met. We need community and to work with one another. We need to be heard, actively heard, and not and recognized and seen and felt in the ways that we should. But are those things easy right now? Absolutely not. And I would contend that, post 2020, it's actually become even harder for folks to fully listen to one another, fully appreciate and see one another, and actually like lean into actually carrying it with somebody else. That's hard for whatever reason it is. And so a lot of the anger and the spite and the hurt that we feel comes from like not fully being seen. But I would also contend too that the people who probably need that like level of attention, in terms of like being pushed back at first, because like when you're doing active harm, that's one thing, but then just beneath that is folks who like haven't experienced love and care in their own classrooms. haven't experienced love and care in their own homes. I wouldn't know what it means to like say, hey, like I can share with you. A lot of what we see in our own schools, for example, is folks trying to compete. Why would you need competition if not to like make other folks feel lesser than you? Why would you need that? You wouldn't need that. And so this notion of sharing is caring is like, oh, we should, like people are learning things from pre-K. Like there were whole lessons we totally missed out, like in daycare, like when we were young. And yet we consistently have to learn those things, and then what it means to actually share with one another, and not just like our resources. Like that's a big thing. And yes, I'm a socialist. I'll just name that. Like we need to be able to share fully, radically redistribute, yada yada, right? And we also need to learn how to like share the world with one another, share like our experiences, talk to one another with peace and sharing in mind, and then be able to say to ourselves, well, like the systems that we have now don't allow for everybody to feel like they belong and that they're also human beings. Let's find a way to share out and let other folks share out so that we can construct something a whole lot better than what we're seeing now. And I think that would make things a whole lot better. And hopefully that's helpful.
I mean, it's an amazing message, Jose, and I appreciate you taking the time to answer all these questions. And there's been a lot of fantastic questions here, and I appreciate everybody joining us. And I can't help but just like wonder the impact of all this has and how powerful it is, both in the long term as more and more folks get involved, but also in the short term. The kids that have gone through our classes that have seen what community is like, have seen what it means to stand up for yourself and push back and have power, and how they'll transform the world as well. So it's awesome to be in a space with all of you doing this work. With that said, we are kind of at the closing hour here. As a heads up, we do have another session in roughly an hour, and then we'll have basically each one of those will be 50 minutes long from 1 o'clock all the way until 6 p.m. Eastern, or UTC -4. So be prepared. But remember, all this stuff, you can take breaks, you can come back to it, etc., and it will be there. But Jose, thank you again so much for sharing.
You're welcome. And I want to leave one last thing, and that is, please don't wait. Don't wait for you to finally like get into doing this. Allow yourself, as soon as you see students, being able to build that in. So I want to thank you all for coming through. Thank you to Chris and Nick for having me. Thank you all for just listening in for the last hour and asking really dope questions. But then also make sure you take these lessons and start applying them as soon as possible. I appreciate y'all for having me today.
Awesome. Thanks so much. All right. See y'all later. Good luck out there. Have a good one. See ya.